It was a rainy Thursday afternoon in Brooklyn, the kind of gray that soaked through the bones and made even the city's noise sound tired. Inside Marino's, an old-world Italian restaurant where the lights were low and the music older than the wallpaper, the regulars sat in their corners pretending not to notice the men in tailored suits near the back. They weren't customers. They were protection. The kind that didn't appear on any payroll. The boss, Vito Marino, sat at the head table, untouched espresso cooling in front of him, a man whose silence spoke louder than most men's anger. For 20 years, he ruled this neighborhood not with chaos, but with precision. If you owed him, you paid. If you crossed him, you disappeared. Yet those who stayed in his shadow said he was fair, almost principled in an unholy world. Then came the sound that shattered that carefully curated calm. The shriek of a child. The door slammed open. Rain blew in. A girl no older than 7 stumbled inside, barefoot, soaked and trembling. She screamed words that turned every head in the restaurant. "They're beating my mama!" The room froze. Forks stopped midair. The pianist's hand hovered above the keys. No one moved, not even the guards at the back. No one, except Vito Marino. He rose slowly, his chair scraping the floor like a warning. His men waited for an order that didn't come. The girl was crying, her voice cracking under the weight of desperation that had no business belonging to a child. And for a moment, just a second, the unbreakable boss felt something break inside him. What the crowd didn't know was that Vito had lost a daughter once, years ago, under circumstances whispered about but never confirmed. They said her mother had taken her and vanished after the bloodiest week in Vito's career. No one dared ask questions. No one dared speak her name. And now, here was a little girl, the mirror of a ghost he could never bury, calling for help inside his sanctuary of silence. The men around him shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't business. This was chaos. The kind that didn't fit inside ledgers or orders. But the look in Vito's eyes told them all this was his business now. Outside, the rain hadn't stopped. The street lamps flickered over puddles thick with oil and dirt. Somewhere beyond the narrow alleyways, someone was hurting that child's mother. And somewhere inside Vito, something that had slept for decades, started to awaken. He didn't ask questions. He didn't send his men. He simply moved. The kind of deliberate movement that made people scatter without a word. They followed anyway, unsure if they were protecting him or the world from what he might do. The streets blurred into a gray smear as they drove. The girl sat in the back seat, silent now, her eyes wide with the kind of trauma no child should know. She pointed, and that was enough. Vito's driver turned toward the industrial end of the block, where the city forgot to care. They found the building an old apartment complex, half condemned, half occupied by people who had nowhere else to go. The screams were faint but unmistakable. Vito stepped out into the rain and walked through the door like he owned it, because in a way, men like him owned everything they touched, even fear. What happened next would change his empire forever. The apartment building stood like a broken tooth in a forgotten jaw of the city, its bricks weeping rainwater, its windows blind with grime. The air reeked of mildew and fear, and the kind of despair that clung to people who'd stopped hoping for rescue. Vito stepped through the warped doorway, the soles of his shoes echoing on the cracked linoleum. Behind him, his men fanned out in silence, guns drawn but heads low. They were used to raids, but not like this. This wasn't about debt or loyalty. This was something primal, something that didn't fit their world of codes and orders. Up the narrow stairwell came the sound-muffled cries, a thud, the low growl of a man too used to breaking things that couldn't fight back. The girl flinched even as she hid behind one of Vito's men. Her tiny hand clenched the hem of her soaked dress. Vito moved first. His presence filled the hallway like a storm rolling in, invisible but impossible to ignore. The door at the end of the hall was half open, the yellow light spilling through it, trembling with the shadows of violence. When he stepped inside, the world seemed to pause. A woman lay crumpled against the wall, one arm twisted protectively around herself. Blood streaked her temple. The man standing over her froze mid-motion, his hand still raised, his face folding into confusion as he recognized the figure in the doorway. The name Marino carried weight in this neighborhood, a weight that crushed. What followed was not chaos. It was order cold, efficient, and wordless. The men who came with Vito didn't need instructions. The rules of the underworld were simple. There were lines even monsters didn't cross. and beating a defenseless woman was one of them. The room went silent after that. The rain outside continued its rhythm, washing the streets clean, but nothing could wash away what had been seen here. The image of the Mafia boss kneeling beside the broken woman, his expression unreadable, his hands steady as he checked her pulse. There was something almost sacred about the stillness in that moment, as if the air itself was waiting to see which version of Vito Marino would rise, the ruthless enforcer or the man who once held a daughter in his arms. She was alive, but barely. He lifted her himself, ignoring the mud, ignoring the whispers. For years, Vito had ordered others to handle the dirty work, but tonight, the dirt was his to bear. They took her to the restaurant, his fortress, his temple of power, but that night, it became something else. The regulars had long gone. The chairs were stacked, the lights dimmed. The girl sat near the kitchen, wrapped in a wool coat far too large for her eyes fixed on the back room where her mother lay. The doctor came. Not a hospital doctor, those asked too many questions, but one of Vito's own, the kind who stitched up bullet wounds and never spoke about it again. He said the woman would live, though the scars visible and unseen would linger. Vito watched in silence. He had seen death, created it, profited from it. But this fragile persistence of life felt foreign. He asked the girl's name, though not out loud. He didn't need to. One of his men murmured it quietly to him later. Sophia, a name that twisted like a knife through his chest. His lost daughter had been named Sophia, too. Coincidence? The rational part of him whispered. But Vito Marino hadn't believed in coincidence since the night his own family vanished. The past didn't fade. It circled back, patient and cruel. As dawn broke, the city outside stirred back to life, unaware that something had shifted in its underbelly. The girl slept at last, exhausted, her head resting on a folded towel. The mother still hadn't woken, and Vito sat in the dark, watching them both, haunted by the growing sense that fate was playing a cruel game, one in which the pieces were all too familiar. The next day, the neighborhood buzzed with whispers. People had seen the girl, seen the boss carry someone from that building. To them, it was another story in the endless book of rumors that surrounded his name. But those inside his circle knew better. Vito had changed. He began asking questions he hadn't asked in years, about missing records, about a woman who had once fled the city with a child, about a betrayal that had driven him deeper into the shadows. His men were unsettled. A distracted boss was a dangerous one, but none dared confront him. He visited the mother each morning, standing at her bedside, silent. The doctor warned that she might not remember much. Trauma could bury memory. But when her eyes finally opened, the air seemed to hold its breath. She stared at him with recognition, not of the infamous man the world knew, but of someone else, someone she had once trusted. The story she would tell, in halting fragments, would unravel everything he thought he knew about the life he'd built. Morning crept into the restaurant like a confession. The first light slipped between the blinds, painting thin stripes across the floor, cutting through smoke that had lingered from the night before. Vito Marino sat in the same chair he had occupied all night, his suit jacket draped over the backrest, his tie loosened, a forgotten cup of espresso cold beside him. He hadn't closed his eyes once. In the next room, the woman slept, the rhythmic rise and fall of her breathing, an unfamiliar sound inside walls used to whispers and threats. The little girl, Sophia, still lay curled on a couch, wrapped in a blanket far too big for her. For the first time in years, the restaurant didn't smell of power or fear. It smelled of antiseptic and rain. Vito felt a strange stillness inside him, a silence that frightened him more than the police ever had. His men hovered nearby, restless, unsure what orders would come. They wanted to return to routine, to the world where business was business and mercy was weakness. But the boss didn't speak. He watched the door of that back room as if it were a portal to another life. When the woman finally stirred, the change in the air was immediate. Her eyes opened slowly, unfocused, and then sharpened with memory that came like the bite of winter air. The doctor murmured something about rest, about concussion and shock, but Vito hardly heard him. The moment the woman looked toward the doorway, toward the man standing in shadow, something passed between them that no witness could interpret. Recognition, not of the notorious name, but of the man beneath it. Hours later, when the restaurant had emptied of everyone but Vito and the two souls' fate had dropped into his kingdom, the truth began to move through him, like a ghost breathing across his skin. He remembered the photo he kept hidden in his office, the one of a young woman holding a baby beside the Brooklyn Bridge, both smiling before the world became cruel. He remembered the headlines from years ago. Car crash on the Hudson. No bodies recovered. He had buried that day in blood and business, using crime to fill the silence. And now, the universe had returned what he had lost, or what remained of it. But nothing about the situation was simple. The woman's features were familiar, yet time and hardship had redrawn them. Her hair was shorter, streaked with gray. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was raw, shaped by years of survival. She told the doctor her name, and when Vito heard it, the world shifted on its axis. It wasn't the name of his wife, it was her sister's. Pieces began to fall into place. His wife had fled years ago, taking their infant daughter with her, vanishing into the chaos he himself had created. No one in his world could ever find them. And now, by a twist of tragedy, the sister, the only family his wife had left, had stumbled back into his path, carrying a child who bore a name that reopened every wound. Sophia wasn't his daughter, but she carried his daughter's name, her eyes, even her quiet strength. It felt like punishment and forgiveness all at once. For days, Vito said nothing. He paid the woman's rent, moved her and the girl into an apartment under his protection, and continued his business as if nothing had changed. But the change was everywhere, small, invisible shifts in the air around him. He stopped shouting. He stopped attending meetings that required fear. He spent nights walking the streets near the river, staring at the water as if it might give him answers. The men around him began to whisper. They said the boss was slipping, that the ghost of his past was softening him. In their world, softness was fatal. Rivals began to circle. Police surveillance intensified. Old enemies sensed weakness, but Vito didn't care. Every time he saw the little girl laugh or watched her mother heal, something inside him rebuilt what the streets had destroyed. For the first time, he understood that power had never protected him, it had only isolated him. And yet, beneath that fragile peace, a darker truth waited to be uncovered. Because fate never returns gifts without demanding payment. A week after the night of the rescue, one of Vito's men came to him with information. The man who had beaten the woman wasn't just another drunk from the neighborhood. He was a collector, a freelancer, working for a rival family that had been digging into old Marino secrets. He'd been searching for someone connected to Vito's missing wife. The words ignited something deep in the boss's chest. If the rival family had found traces of his past, they would not stop until they unearthed the whole story. That meant the woman and the child were no longer victims, they were targets. Vito began to move again, quietly, efficiently, the way he once had when he was feared across the 5 boroughs. He reassigned guards. He doubled security. He shut down every channel that could be traced back to his name. But no amount of power could protect him from the question now circling his mind. If the rival family knew about the woman, did they also know what had really happened to his wife and daughter? He hadn't told anyone, not even his closest men, that years ago he had discovered a piece of evidence, a bracelet pulled from the river, engraved with his daughter's initials. He had assumed it was all that was left of her. But now, as he looked at little Sophia's face, he wondered if the river had lied. At night, he dreamed of 2 children instead of 1, the ghost of the girl he lost and the living one who carried her name. And between them stood the river, dark and endless. He began to visit the woman's apartment in the evenings, standing outside on the sidewalk, watching through the curtain as she read to the girl. Sometimes she looked out, sensing him there, but neither acknowledged the other. It was an unspoken ritual, a confession made in silence. Then came the night when everything collapsed again. It started with a phone call, a single word from one of his men. Trouble. The rival family had made its move. A shipment intercepted, 2 of his men dead, and a message left behind. A child's toy, broken, soaked in red paint. It wasn't business. It was personal. Vito understood immediately. They weren't coming for his empire. They were coming for the girl. The city never really slept. It only changed voices. By midnight, the sound of traffic faded and was replaced by sirens, distant laughter, and the low hum of menace that pulsed beneath every streetlight. That night, the city's voice carried a warning. Vito Marino stood in his office at the back of the restaurant, staring at the skyline through rain-blurred glass. He had built an empire brick by brick, lie by lie, and now it was beginning to crumble. Not from law or betrayal, but from something far smaller, a 7-year-old girl who had walked into his world and reminded him that monsters are not born, they're made. His men moved quietly outside his door. They knew war was coming. The rival family, the Costas, had sent a message too bold to ignore. The toy left behind wasn't just intimidation, it was declaration. They had found his weakness, and, in their world, that was a death sentence. At 1 a.m., a car engine idled too long outside. By 1:05, the first gunshot shattered the windows. Glass rained down like ice. The restaurant became a battlefield. Vito moved like a man who had already died once. He directed his men with the precision of muscle memory, turning tables into barricades, shadows into weapons. But even as bullets split the air, his thoughts were elsewhere on the small apartment 2 streets over, where the woman and child he had promised to protect were sleeping under the illusion of safety. The assault lasted minutes, though it felt like hours. When silence finally returned, 3 of his men lay still, the air thick with gunpowder and regret. The Costas hadn't meant to win tonight. They meant to distract him. By the time Vito reached the street, he saw the second car speeding away toward the river. Inside it, he knew, was everything that mattered. He gave chase in a borrowed sedan, headlights cutting through the fog like knives. Each block blurred into the next neon, rain, asphalt. The car ahead fishtailed on the slick road, the driver panicking under the weight of his cargo, the woman, terrified but unbroken, and the little girl, whose silent tears painted lines down her cheeks. Vito's world narrowed to the rhythm of the tires and the pounding in his chest. He wasn't a boss now. He wasn't even a man seeking vengeance. He was a father chasing ghosts. Near the old river bridge, the rival car lost control. It skidded sideways, slammed into a guardrail, and came to rest half dangling over the edge. Flames licked from the hood. Rain hissed as it hit the fire. Vito pulled over and ran toward the wreckage. He tore open the back door, dragging the woman and child out one by one. The driver, already gone, stared blankly into the dark. The flames climbed higher. The bridge trembled beneath the storm. For a moment, the scene became a mirror of another night. Years ago, the night his wife's car had gone into the same river. The night everything had ended. And then, in the flicker of firelight, he saw it. Around the little girl's neck hung a chain silver, thin, engraved with initials he recognized. Not the name of the woman he had saved, the name of the daughter he had lost. The truth struck like a bullet. The girl he thought was merely a reflection of the past was the past. The woman was not her aunt at all. She was someone who had raised the child in hiding, protecting her from the world Vito had built. The car crash years ago had not been a death, it had been an escape. His wife had fled, only to die later under another name, leaving the child with the only friend she could trust. Every story he'd told himself about loss, vengeance, and destiny collapsed into one blinding realization. He had spent decades becoming the very thing his family had run from. Sirens wailed in the distance. Police, rivals, maybe both. It didn't matter. He looked at the girl, trembling but alive, and knew what he had to do. He placed her in the arms of the woman and whispered instructions only they could hear, promises carved in the language of redemption. Then he turned toward the approaching headlights. When the police reached the bridge minutes later, they found Vito Marino standing alone beside the burning wreck, hands raised, face calm, as if surrender itself were a kind of peace. He didn't resist. He didn't speak. He simply watched as the woman's car disappeared into the night, carrying the only part of his soul worth saving. Months later, the restaurant reopened under new ownership. The sign above the door had been changed, the name Marino's painted over with a single word, Sophia's. Locals said it served the best espresso in Brooklyn. They said the owner, a quiet woman with kind eyes, never spoke about the past. And every Sunday, a little girl stood on a stool behind the counter, polishing glasses while the morning light poured through the windows. She wore a silver chain around her neck, the initials faint but still visible, a small legacy of a man who had finally learned that power means nothing without love. Far away, in a cell where sunlight rarely reached, Vito Marino sat by a window and watched a thin beam of light trace across the floor. He didn't count days. He didn't dream of freedom. He had already found it the night he let them go. And somewhere beyond the bars, the city kept its promise to forget him, except for the faint rumor whispered through the alleys whenever rain began to fall, that once A little girl had run into a restaurant screaming for help, and the devil himself had answered her prayer.